Yeah, that's the harsh thing about titling books in academics. So I'm doing something totally different. And tonight I want to talk about who Chuck Norris is. So if you do an internet search about Chuck Norris, you're bound to discover some of the following. Chuck Norris counted to infinity twice. Chuck Norris doesn't wear a watch. He decides what time it is. This was my favorite. There is no theory of evolution, just a list of creatures Chuck Norris allows to live. Chuck Norris can speak Braille. Chuck Norris's tears cure cancer, although he never cries. Chuck Norris has a diary. It's called the Guinness Book of World Records. Chuck Norris tells Simon what to do. Chuck Norris is the reason Waldo is hiding. And Chuck can divide by 0. So, there's so many facts about Chuck Norris that somebody saw fit to collect them and to publish a book called The Truth About Chuck Norris, 400 Facts About the World's Greatest Human by Ian Spector. Now, you see what's going on here. Chuck Norris is, for those of you who are old enough to know, my wife is convinced that there's people in this room who are not old enough to know who Chuck Norris is. But for those of you who are old enough, you'll recognize him as an action figure or a film action hero from such movies as Return of the Dragon, Missing in Action, Code of Silence, or The Delta Force. Who didn't love the Delta Force? That was one of my favorites when I was 13, I think. So, but you see what's going on here. He gained renown for his toughness and his skill as a martial artist and forged a reputation as an American icon in his film career. And this reputation has given birth to a running string of internet memes. They've become so popular, it's spawned a whole genre of other internet memes that attach themselves to all sorts of figures. So this is Kiko Alonso. And Kiko Alonso has his own set of similar internet memes, which became known as the legend of Kiko Alonso, because when he broke into the NFL in 2013 with the Buffalo Bills, he had a tremendous rookie season, so much so that people decided he was just as good as Chuck Norris. This is maybe someone you don't recognize. This is Omar Suleiman, who ran for president in Egypt in 2012, and his supporters decided to develop their whole campaign around Chuck Norris internet memes. So all of his campaign slogans have things to do with, Omar Suleiman, doesn't get wet, water gets Omar. Things like that. Unfortunately, Omar Suleiman didn't survive the 2012 presidential election. So, Chuck Norris's notoriety for toughness and virility has really become a whole new language for talking about qualities we admire in other people. So what does Chuck have to do with Jeremiah? What do they have in common? Well, I'll admit it, at a glance, not a lot. Jeremiah cries a lot, apparently. But I will suggest to you this. Similar to the transmission and massive dispersion of the Chuck Norris facts, in ancient Judaism, the facts about the 6th century prophet Jeremiah took on a life of their own that went well beyond the man himself to forge a variety of lasting and meaningful memories within the national consciousness. In effect, Jeremiah the man, as is depicted by Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, became bigger and actually eclipsed Jeremiah the book. So I wrote a book that the title, I can't even remember the name of the title because it's so long all the time. But in the first part of my book, I dealt with a series of texts known only from Qumran called the Apocryphon of Jeremiah. See, it's a fairly detailed and especially boring textual study of these fragments. Here's 3 copies of this manuscript. There's 4 or 5, depending on how many of these fragments you actually think belong to the same text. But the Apocryphon of Jeremiah, see, was so named because it seems to have a lot to do with Jeremiah. It consists of 3 parts. First, there's a collection of biblical prophecies that are based on texts from places other than Jeremiah, but seem to have something to do with Jeremiah. This is then followed by a narrative account about Jeremiah and his time spent with the people from Jerusalem just on the eve of their exile to Babylon. Then in the third part, it's a fragmentary text. There's lots of gaps in between. In the third part of the text, Jeremiah is then depicted living with the Jews who were decided to move to Taphanes, which is in Egypt. And Jeremiah went and lived with them. And then he's pictured writing a letter from Egypt to the exiles who are in Babylon. And the contents of this letter are actually quite incredible. In this letter, he gives them a new prophecy, an apocalyptic foretelling of the last days, very similar to the apocalyptic prophecies that Andy mentioned in Daniel 7, 9, and 11. Now, the point here is that even though this text doesn't really have much to do with the book of Jeremiah, it's clearly a popular text for the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls who saw fit to recopy it several times. But the key to understanding its importance is not to fixate on the text, on its textual content necessarily, but to see how various and sundry traditions fit together under the guise of Jeremiah's reputation. The text of Jeremiah appears to have been moderately significant in early Judaism in the reading and interpretation of authoritative sacred literature, but really, when it gets down to it, it was his reputation as a prophet for exile, a prophet of the exile, as a figure associated with the new covenant, as a powerful opponent to the forces of false prophecy. And these are the things that tended to distinguish Jeremiah as a foundational figure, not just for the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, but really for all of Judaism. Jeremiah and echoes of his personality are popping up all over the place in Jewish literature. And I mean, they continue today. There's an English word that has been founded on the character of Jeremiah. Someone who's just a big complainer all the time. You can call him a Jeremiah. So how does this work? I'm going to look at just 2 texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls today. The first is the Damascus document. This is a text that's commonly described as a sort of constitutional document for the Dead Sea Scrolls community. In column 8, there's a rather cryptic appearance of Jeremiah by name. And I have this text up here on the screen. It says, "As such is the rule for the returnees of Israel," or the converts of Israel, "who turned aside from the way of the people by the love of God for the former ones who bore witness after him. He loves those who come after them, because theirs is the covenant of the fathers. And by hatred of the wall builders, his anger is kindled. And this same judgment will be for everyone who rebels against the prospects of God, or precepts of God, So he will abandon them, and they will turn away in the stubbornness of their heart." And the stubbornness of their heart is a Jeremianic expression that appears with some frequency in Jeremiah. It's found originally in Deuteronomy, but Jeremiah quite liked it when describing the people that he was speaking to. It's kind of rude, so I won't call you stubborn in your heart. But here's the point. This is the word that Jeremiah declared to Baruch, the son of Neriah, and to Elisha to Gehazi, his servant. All the men who enter the new covenant in the land of Damascus. So Jeremiah's mention here seems significant in that it serves as the concluding statement for the sermon that precedes this part of the text. The final word on the matter of who is included among the returnees or the converts of Israel belongs to Jeremiah, and is held concurrently in tandem with the teaching of Moses that precedes it earlier in column 8. And yet, we're left as readers to guess about precisely what that final word was. The text itself remains a little bit of a mystery. It's a quandary for most interpreters just because they can't locate it textually. And that's the problem. As a textual appraisal, it doesn't help us. But by reconsidering this passage, not as an employment of an authoritative text, but rather as one of an authoritative figure, things become a little more clear, especially if we can learn something about how the reputation of Jeremiah was understood and used elsewhere in the scrolls, elsewhere in early Judaism. So, looking beyond the text to see how a towering figure like Jeremiah from Judaism's collective memory featured in their ongoing imagination, we are then able to uncover critical interpretative aspects within a wide range of texts that ordinarily would evade us. Take a look, for example, at how this works in another text from Qumran called the Hodayot. The Hodayot is a collection of songs of praise directed to God. It's anonymous, but many scholars attribute it to the founder of the Qumran community, who we call the teacher of righteousness. So there's a selection of songs within this collection that have been designated teacher hymns because of their intensely personal introspection, and they're thought to be something like private confessions, somewhat similar to the confessions of Jeremiah that appear in Jeremiah chapter 11 to 20 in our biblical books. One of these teacher hymns appears to reflect on Jeremiah's prophetic reputation as an archetype for righteousness and contrasts it to the wickedness of his prophetic opponents. And here it is. It begins at the end of column 7, and I'll just read the first 2 parts of it here for you. I know by your understanding that it is not by human strength. A man's way is not in himself, nor is a person able to determine his steps. But I know that in your hand is the inclination of every spirit, and all his works you have determined before ever you created him. How should any be able to change your words? You alone have created the righteous one, and from the womb you established him to give heed to your covenant at the appointed time of grace, and to walk in all things, nourishing himself in the abundance of your compassion, and relieving all the distress of his soul for an eternal salvation and everlasting peace without want. Thus you raised his glory above the mortal. In short, righteous man, good. But the other side of this coin, the wicked. You created for the time of your wrath, and from the womb you set them apart for the day of slaughter. For they walk in a way, I bet Chuck Norris is going to be involved in the day of slaughter, by the way. For they walk in a way which is not profitable, and they reject your covenant, and their soul abhors your truth. They have no delight in all that you have commanded, but they have chosen that which you hate. All of those you have prepared them in order to execute great judgments among them before your creatures, that they might be a sign, an eternal sign perhaps, so that all might know your glory and your great power. So there's a contrast here between the righteous and the wicked. And what's really intriguing about this text is that it draws on several key words and phrases from Jeremiah chapter 12:3 and from Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 5. In 12:3, it reads, you, O Lord, know me. You see me and test my heart towards you. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter, and set them apart for the day of slaughter. There's a repeated refrain, an emphatic expression in the Hodayot, where the writer, the speaker, the singer says, I know, reflective of what Yahweh knows. From the womb you set them apart for the day of slaughter, says the psalmist about the wicked in this text. Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 5 is quite famous. This is the commissioning statement of Jeremiah, in which Yahweh says to Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And there's this reflection within both sides of this psalm in the Hodayot, where the speaker says that both the righteous and the wicked were established from the womb. So why is he doing this? Now, I will suggest to you that this is not merely a poetical tactic by which to supply images and metaphors for this writer. He's saying something significant about Jeremiah's own distinction as a man, as a prophetic figure, relative to the character of the righteous and the wicked. He's situating himself, speaking in the first person, he's situating himself in the call of Jeremiah to make a claim about his own prophetic credentials, to place in his own place on the right side of the imagined conflict between the forces of good and evil that he's got going on here. So the key to the message is in many ways found in the Jeremiah facts that everybody just knew. And this tendency was not exclusive to the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We find Jeremianic material in all sorts of early Jewish literature. We find it in the book of Daniel, and in 1st to 4th Baruch. We find it in 2nd Maccabees. The man of sorrows in the Gospel of Mark is often thought to be reflective of the figure and the depiction of Jeremiah. And the Apostle Paul actually quotes and alludes to this calling text from Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 5 when he's attempting to establish his own prophetic credentials to his audience in Galatia. So the point here is that Jeremiah's reputation was in itself an authoritative feature within the literature. It was a galvanizing feature by which all sorts of traditions were brought together and created new traditions and new texts. So, in the end here, who is Jeremiah? Well, some might think the world's greatest prophet, and this was actually what I wanted to call my book, but the publisher said no. So these couple of examples, brief examples from the scrolls, just serves to illustrate two ways in which Jeremiah's reputation itself served an authoritative function. This is a different kind of usage of Scripture, but it's one that we see reflected in so many other presentations that appeared here tonight in the traditions belonging to the book of Daniel. How important was it that these belonged to Daniel in the covenant of the perpetual priesthood belonging to Phinehas? These people had enduring images of these people, of these founders in antiquity that had a tremendous amount of importance in how they read texts. So, while we recognize the Chuck Norris facts for what they are, they're good-natured embellishments to an absurd degree of the real Chuck Norris. But we see also how useful this embellishment is for making claims when it's applied to other public figures. Jeremiah is a little bit like Chuck. He became an icon for promoting various important ideas about righteousness, about accurate prophecy, about temple legitimacy, and what have you. And sometimes locating these is in understanding who Jeremiah was first, before reading the text. His reputation was used to transform past scriptural traditions and to provide them with new meaning. So, when you leave here tonight and you think of Jeremiah, think of Chuck Norris. And vice versa. Next time you watch a Chuck Norris movie, if you ever have to watch another one, make sure you remember that Jeremiah has his own facts. Thank you.